Welcome back! Today, we're diving into a really fascinating explainer, where we examine a source document that completely deconstructs a very common apologetic argument about textual corruption. The source material we're looking at today goes incredibly deep into the ancient manuscript traditions of the Torah, and then it compares them directly against the claims made within the Quran. It is a wildly detailed analysis, and we're going to walk through the evidence step by step exactly as the source lays it out.
Here's the roadmap for our explainer today. We're moving from the initial claim to the final deduction. First, we'll look at the core argument and its main flaw. Then, we'll define true textual variants, examine the actual ancient manuscript evidence, explore a specific verification test set up by the Quran, and finally, look at the evidence-based conclusion.
All right, Section 1, the core argument and the flaw. Let's analyze what the source calls a major category mistake. So, the source starts by identifying the foundational premise of this argument, which is essentially this. If the Torah were completely preserved, then a real contradiction between the Quran and the present Torah would naturally follow. Basically, the idea being analyzed here is that because there are narrative contradictions between the two texts, the Torah must not be perfectly preserved. But the document argues that this logic relies on a massive critical flaw. And here is where the source says the whole thing kind of goes off the rails. It argues that the apologetic totally confuses minor textual variants, which are 100% normal, with core narrative corruption, which the source insists definitively does not exist in the Torah. Think about it. Whenever humans copy documents by hand over centuries, whether it's the Torah, the Quran, or, Shakespeare, variants are going to happen. But the analysis points out that we absolutely have to distinguish between standard, everyday transmission variants and the complete, ground-up rewriting of historical events. To really drive this point home, the document notes that 100% word-for-word identical preservation, that just doesn't exist in any ancient hand-copied text, period. It even points out that Muslim scholars openly acknowledge textual variants in the Quran itself, known as the different readings, or qira'at. There were variations in spelling and synonyms across different regions, which actually is why Caliph Uthman eventually standardized the text and burned competing, legitimate manuscripts. But here's the kicker. Islamic scholars accept these variants because they don't change core doctrines. The source argues that this exact same standard has to be applied to the Torah. If the Quran stories are considered stable despite variants, the Torah stories are stable despite variants.
Moving right along to Section 2, defining true textual variants. What does textual plurality actually look like when scholars get their hands on ancient manuscripts? The source draws a really hard line here, bringing in the work of top textual scholars. True textual variants includes things like spelling variations, writing the same word with slightly different lettering, or word order differences, maybe minor scribal notes for clarity. What scholars definitely do not find are massive narrative shifts. We don't suddenly find different patriarchs, different covenant recipients, or entirely different sacrifice accounts. The historical claims remain completely rock solid.
Okay, Section 3, the ancient manuscript evidence. Let's look at the hard data regarding this claim of narrative stability.
The corruption theory claims that over time, the text was systematically altered, like changing Ishmael to Isaac or scrubbing out references to Mecca. But if that actually happened, you'd expect to find at least some paper trail, right? Like a pre-corruption manuscript or a regional variation that preserved the original story. Yet, the source is absolutely emphatic here. There is zero manuscript evidence for this. Literally none. No manuscript out there says Ishmael was bound on the altar, and no manuscript places Abraham down in Mecca.
Look at this data. We are talking about absolute, unanimous agreement across every single major textual tradition regarding the core patriarchal narratives. Genesis 17, 21, 22. The text overwhelmingly and unanimously points to Isaac as the son of the covenant and the son bound on the altar. The analysis states plainly that if there were ancient texts claiming Ishmael was the one bound, scholars would have documented them as a massive textual variant. But they just don't exist.
And think about the sheer improbability of a unified corruption conspiracy here. The document points out the distinct communities preserving these texts. You've got the Dead Sea Scrolls community from Qumran, centuries before Christ. You have the Samaritans, who fiercely opposed the Jews and definitely wouldn't cooperate in a giant theological cover-up. And you have the Egyptian Jews who translated the Septuagint. We're talking about highly hostile communities completely separated by geography and theology, yet they all preserved the exact same narrative. If corruption happened, at least one of these isolated groups would have held onto the original text, but none of them did.
So the crucial takeaway the source emphasizes is that people are simply asking the wrong question. It's a false standard to ask if the text is 100% word-for-word identical. As we established, no ancient text does that. The right question, the accurate metric, is, are the Torah's story narratives preserved? And based on a mountain of manuscript evidence, the source concludes the answer is a definitive yes. The stories are preserved. Which brings us to Section 4, the Quran's verification test. This is where things get really interesting, as the document pivots to how the Quran itself requires this exact concept of narrative preservation.
The document points us straight to Surah 12, verse 111. This verse explicitly claims that the Quran is a confirmation of what is between his hands, meaning the existing Torah. But it doesn't just broadly confirm general vibes. It uses the Arabic word tafsil, meaning a detailed explanation. By claiming to confirm the previous scripture in precise detail, the Quran is essentially creating its own built-in theological verification test.
The source outlines the logic of this test meticulously. Step 1. The Quran indicates Muhammad is relaying detailed stories he was previously unaware of. Step 2. The Quran offers these miracles of detailed revelation as proof of its divine origin, claiming they perfectly match the existing Torah. Therefore, Step 3, for this claim to actually be verified, those previous scriptures must have stable, verifiable narratives. You simply can't verify precise historical details against a corrupted text, right? The whole argument for legitimacy relies on the Torah's narratives being intact. All right, final stretch. Section 5, the final evidence-based conclusion. Let's apply this test and see what happens. So we apply the test and boom, the source argues a massive contradiction pops up. As we saw with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Samaritan texts, the story narratives of the Torah absolutely are preserved. The Quran then claims to confirm these exact preserved stories in detail. Yet when we actually place them side by side, the Quran's version contradicts the unanimously preserved Torah's version. According to the document, the problem here isn't that the Torah is corrupted. The problem is that the Torah is preserved, and the two texts just don't match. Just to get specific, here are the unresolvable narrative contradictions the source highlights. The universally preserved Torah definitively says Isaac was the covenant son, and Isaac was bound on the altar. It details Jacob's reaction to Joseph's apparent death by tearing his clothes in mourning, while the Quranic account has him turning away and losing his sight. And across all traditions, the preserved Torah never once mentions Mecca, the Kaaba, or Abraham taking a trip down to Arabia. And so, the explainer concludes by flipping that initial apologetic argument totally on its head. It leaves us with this final heavy thought. If the Quran explicitly requires the Torah's narratives to be preserved so its own detailed stories can be verified, but then ends up directly contradicting those unanimously preserved, historically verified narratives, does the original corruption argument just completely collapse on itself? Based strictly on the evidentiary standard presented in this document, the source asserts that the Quran's own verification test ultimately disproves the very argument it tries to make. It's a fascinating analysis and definitely something to deeply consider as we evaluate historical texts and manuscript evidence.